Are you looking for security architect interview questions? If so, this video is for you. Hi, this is Mike Gibbs, and I am here to help you with your next security architect interview. And in this video, I'll be presenting 5 security architect interview questions and how I would answer them if I was looking to be hired as a security architect. So the first security architect interview question I will ask is, how do you ensure security is an enabler rather than a blocker to a business, which is a real issue and many hiring managers ask this question. I would answer it something like this. I would say for me, security starts with the business objectives. And what I do is I align any security initiative or any architecture and initiative for that matter with regards to whatever the business is looking for, whether that be revenue growth, customer trust, operational resilience. And in order to make sure that security is an enabler of that business, what I do is I design guardrails as opposed to gates. For example, I may come up with some type of a standardized or an automated security pattern that enables teams to move quickly within safe boundaries. I make sure that we embed security early. So we embed security into the architectural design, DevSecOps pipeline, product planning from the very beginning, not after deployment. I tend to make sure we focus on as many frictionless security experiences as possible. So, for example, single sign-on and adaptive multi-factor authentication, as opposed to constant re-authentication. We want to make it easy for the users to actually use so they don't find workarounds. And I always make sure we translate security into business language. Instead of we need X or we need this firewall or we need whatever, I would typically say to the executive team, this control will reduce the likelihood of breach by, say, 40% and therefore protect $50 million in revenue exposure or something to that. Always tie it back to the business because we're architects. The next security architect interview question will be, how do you balance risk, cost, and user experience in your security design? Here's how I recommend answer it. I would say something like, I use a risk-based decision model in that every control must map to some type of a specific and quantified business risk. And then I'll evaluate everything in the context of these 3 things. What is the risk reduction we're actually gaining? What is the cost to build, operate, and the complexity of an architecture? And what is the user or the developer experience going to be like? And when we know that, I first start by prioritizing high risk and low friction controls first. And in many cases, we can add some form of a multi-factor authentication, some better logging into Siemens source systems, any kind of better identity controls. And these are typically big impact and very low cost. Now, I tend to avoid controls that don't make sense because there are many controls that will add a lot of friction, but they provide minimal risk reduction. So if that's the case on one of those types of controls, unless we need it, we try not to use it. I tend to design tiered security models and that not all systems need the same level of control. For example, protecting the crown jewels is different than some administrative app that's not very important that has minimal data inside it. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to try to leverage automation whenever possible to reduce cost, to reduce friction. And that means that the engineers that are implementing these things will be using policy as code, automated compliance, CI/CD security checks, for example. The next security architect interview question that I'm going to ask is, how do you prioritize security investments when budgets are constrained? Now, almost every manager asks this security architect interview question because budgets are always constrained. So here's how I would answer that question. Whenever it comes to prioritizing security investments, I always start with a business impact analysis. And with that, I need to know what systems generate revenue, what systems create actual risk for the organization along the way. And then what I do is I map investments to risk reduction per dollar spent. So we want to look for the biggest risk reduction at the lowest cost. I typically map the investments to regulatory requirements because regulations may specify certain things and we have to meet those objectives. And I always map investments to business critical services. Now, in order to do this, first I focus on foundational controls, identity, multi-factor authentication, for example. To logging and visibility, we need to know what's going on, so I make sure we've got a very good logging set up into SIEM and source systems. Network segmentation, this is one of your cheapest ways to greatly enhance your security, and whether that's segmenting into VLANs or access control lists or multiple VPCs that don't communicate with each other, any kind of network segmentation or firewalls we can do, we definitely want to use, and a very strong backup and recovery approach. I try to eliminate or redundant tools, which you find in many architectures, or low value tools, because tool sprawl is one of those big budget killers where people have too many tools, they're not using much of anything out of the tools, and it adds a lot of complexity and it tends to kill budgets. And then I try to build it into a phase roadmap. So let's go first with our quick wins. Then let's go for some midterm improvements. And then obviously we've got our long-term investments, long-term transformation. And in order to make it sink and to stick with the executive audience that's going to fund this, I make sure that I always communicate the ROI of the security architecture in terms of risk reduction. This $1 million investment, it reduces breach probability by, say, whatever percent, and it protects this amount of revenue. So it's always being seen as an investment with an ROI, typically in terms of risk reduction. This question is extremely common for security architects on interviews and even other architects as well. How do you define and measure the security architecture success? Here's how I would answer that. Security success is not just the absence of breaches, even though that's a key goal. The measure of success is really about our resilience, our risk reduction, and our business alignment. So I'm going to measure the effectiveness of the security architecture across several domains. The first domain is risk reduction. And that means the reduction in attack surface, a decrease in, say, critical vulnerabilities, and improved security postures. What is our residual risk after we mitigated some of the risk that we had? The second thing that I'm going to be looking for is detection and response. Say mean time to detect, mean time to repair, to respond to something, because we want to see how good we've gotten, how good our playbooks and architectures got us to contain incidents if and when they occur. The next thing to judge an architecture's effectiveness is business alignment. The security initiatives need to be tied into some business outcome. So, is there minimal friction for the users, and are they using the security of the system? And is the security enabling them to do things faster, or is it slowing them down? We have to check that. And I always check compliance and governance. So, what is our audit success rate? Are we adhering to the policy? And if so, in what percentage of the time? What kind of reductions in our expenses? So that's really giving us a lot. I tend to look at leading indicators as well, not just the lagging indicators that we talked about before. Some leading indicators could be percentage of workloads, for example, enabled with least privilege, percentage of systems that are covered by centralized logging, percentage of identities with multi-factor authentication. So the key is security is measurable. We just have to measure the right things. Okay, now another security architect interview question for you. How do you evaluate emerging security technologies for adoption? Ooh, that's one that happens a lot. And what they're gauging for is that you're not chasing shiny object syndrome. You need it because it's new, cool, and exciting. So here's the way I would answer that question. I would say, I do not start with the technology. I actually start with the actual business problem first. What risks are we solving? What gaps exist in our current architecture? So accordingly, I'm going to evaluate emerging technologies across several criteria other than them being cool. The first criteria is business alignment. Does this emerging technology support our strategic goals? Does it reduce any meaningful risk? It needs to be included. Second is architectural fit. Does this emerging technology integrate with our existing ecosystem? Does it support our hybrid multi-cloud needs, which are most enterprises need, for example? Third would be operational impact. What is the complexity to deploy and manage this emerging security technology? And what is the skill needed to operate this technology? I typically look at the cost versus the value. What's this thing gonna cost? Not just the licensing, but the total cost of ownership, and what is the measurable risk reduction I'm gonna get out of it? And I typically also look at the vendor maturity. What is that vendor's market presence? Are they stable? Do they have a good support and ecosystem? Because that's what we're really looking for. Now, that gets us half the way there. I typically like to validate with, say, a proof of value, not just a proof of concept. So we want to look and see, is it going to improve outcomes in our environment? And that's really what I do in order to make sure that we evaluate emerging technologies to see if they're going to fit in our environment. If you'd like to become an enterprise architect, a security architect, an artificial intelligence architect, a multi-cloud architect, we run 2 completely free architecture webinars per week. You can register for these architecture webinars by clicking on the link in the description of this video. And on these free architecture webinars, which are on Zoom, we'll talk about what we do as security architects, the skills you need as a security architect, or any other architect career for that matter, based upon the webinar. We'll talk about what hiring managers are looking for. We'll talk about how to actually get interviews without necessarily recklessly applying to 1,000,001 places. And then I'll answer any kind of architecture career question you have about enterprise architect careers, security architect careers, AI architect careers, multi-cloud architect careers, network architect careers, or any architecture career for that matter. Like I said, register for one of these free architecture webinars. The description is in this video, and these sessions are live and free, and you can ask any questions, and we'll answer them live and free. If you'd like to become an architect, we have complete architecture training programs for any architecture career, like an enterprise architect or a security architect. You can learn more about them on the Go Cloud Careers website. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell to be notified of new videos to assist you in your architecture career. This is Mike Gibbs signing off for now, and I hope to see you soon.